167. Now, that is a massive, honestly staggering number. I want you to just hold on to that as we get started today because it represents the sheer annihilating force it took to finally end the most notorious crime spree in American history. And it really brings up a fascinating question. What did it actually take to stop America's most famous outlaws? You know, we've all seen the movies, we all know the names. But today, we're going to set aside that glossy Hollywood myth and take a hard look at the brutally violent, desperate reality. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the historical records, looking at the actual photographs and going over the undeniable forensic evidence to see how the romanticized illusion of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow stacks up against the truth. Part 1. The Depression's Desperate Outlaws. There's this quote from the era that I think captures their desperate origins perfectly. It goes, "It was chickens and turkeys. It was survival first and foremost." You see, the Barrow family lived in a level of just disenfranchised poverty that is honestly hard for us to fathom today. They lacked formal education. Clyde and his brother Buck, they didn't start off as these glamorous bank robbers plotting sophisticated heists. Not at all. They kicked off their crime spree simply by stealing poultry, literally just to avoid starving to death in rural Texas. To really understand how they managed to get away with it for so long, we have to look at the grim world they were living in. The 1930s meant extreme poverty, starvation, and widespread unemployment. And because banks were foreclosing on family farms left and right, there was this deep, pervasive anti-government and anti-bank sentiment across the country. People were angry and they were hungry. So, when Bonnie and Clyde started holding up places, everyday people, who felt like the whole system was rigged against them, mistakenly viewed these desperate thieves as Robin Hood figures. They actually thought the outlaws were striking back at the man. It was a completely dangerous illusion, for sure, but a really intoxicating one for a public that was struggling just to survive.
Which leads us to Part 2, the suicide Sal persona.
Now, you've probably seen this infamous 1932 snapshot of Bonnie Parker. She's holding a pistol, got a cigar in her mouth. Well, that photo was actually found by police in a Joplin, Missouri hideout right after the gang had to flee. The cops developed the film, the newspapers printed it nationwide, and boom, it instantly cemented their glamorous public image. And Bonnie, who was actually a highly intelligent, aspiring poet, deliberately leaned into this rebellious persona. She even wrote a poem called The Story of Suicide Sal, crafting this whole alter ego for herself as a tough gangster gal who was fully prepared to die for her man. But we really need to put that myth side by side with the truth. The movies love to portray them as beautiful, sharply dressed, and rolling in cash from daring bank jobs. The reality? Their crimes were clumsy. They mostly targeted small gas stations and mom-and-pop grocery stores, and sometimes they risked their lives for nothing more than some spare change. They were perpetually exhausted, incredibly dirty, and living in absolute constant fear. They were sleeping in stolen cars, bathing in rivers, eating cold food straight out of tin cans. These were not glamorous masterminds. Honestly, they were living like hunted animals. Let's look at what kept them running. Part 3. The V8 death car. Clyde Barrow was incredibly audacious. So audacious, in fact, that he reportedly wrote a letter directly to Henry Ford himself. He wrote, "While I still have breath in my lungs, I will tell you what a dandy car you make." I mean, wow. He was literally praising Ford for the exact engineering that allowed his gang to repeatedly outrun law enforcement all across the central United States. And that car, the 1934 Ford V8 Deluxe sedan, was basically the ultimate getaway vehicle. Its V8 engine offered superior speed and power, easily outclassing the much heavier, slower police cruisers of the day. Plus, Ford cars were everywhere, so their design blended right into traffic, and spare parts were easy to find, making repairs simple, even when they were on the run. This specific dark gray sedan that became their rolling fortress, they brazenly stole it right out of a driveway in Topeka, Kansas, just weeks before their final ride.
So how did it end? Part 4, the 167-bullet ambush.
Let's walk through exactly how this trap was sprung, because it was meticulously orchestrated. Led by a former Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer, a posse of 6 heavily armed lawmen sets up just outside of Gibbsland, Louisiana, on May 23, 1934. Early that morning, they hide themselves deep in the brush along a quiet rural highway. To bait the trap, they get a man named Ivy Methvin, the father of one of the gang's members, to park his truck on the side of the road and pretend he has a flat tire. Right around 9:15 a.m., Bonnie and Clyde approach in that Ford V8. Clyde, being an expert driver, spots the truck and slows down to see if he can help. And the exact second that car slows down, the posse unleashes just a deafening torrent of gunfire.
They gave the outlaws absolutely zero chance to surrender.
Which brings us right back to our opening number, 167. That is the estimated number of bullets and buckshot fired directly into that car. The lawmen just poured lead into the Ford until every single weapon was completely empty. It wasn't a shootout. It was a total annihilation that instantly shredded the vehicle and ended the lives of Bonnie and Clyde in just a matter of seconds.
Part 5. The macabre aftermath.
Now, these are the chilling, first-hand notes from an undertaker at the McKamy-Campbell Funeral Home in Dallas. He wrote, "Her right hand nearly blown off, torn up so she was a mass of blood, caked and dried. Used gold dust to remove most of it." The 100-pound Bonnie Parker was so physically mutilated by the buckshot and bullets that morticians spent hours just trying to sew her remains back together. They literally had to use gold dust, a commercial scouring powder, just to clean off the dried blood, all while dealing with a horrific odor. I mean, there was absolutely nothing romantic or glamorous about how they ended up on those tables. But you know what's crazy? The public's obsession only intensified. 40,000. That is the estimated number of spectators who swarmed the Dallas funeral home in this insane, almost carnival-like frenzy, just to get a glimpse of Bonnie's body. The crowd was so huge that people were lined up all the way to Fair Park, bringing packed lunches like they were attending a picnic. The funeral home had to call in nearly 40 police officers working in shifts just to keep the mob from literally tearing the building apart. Public fascination had just completely overridden basic human decency. And eventually, that bullet-riddled death car itself, it was sold and dragged all over the country as a sideshow attraction. And finally, we have this one last tragic detail. Bonnie Parker was laid to rest buried in an ice blue negligee. It's just a sad, incredibly intimate, and ultimately pathetic final image. Far from the defiant, machine gun-toting suicide sow she wrote about in her poems, she ended up a mutilated casualty of a hopeless, desperate life buried in her sleepwear. So, we've walked through the extreme poverty, the constant terror, the stolen spare change, and that brutal, mangled end, which leaves us with a pretty big question. Why do we continue to romanticize this desperate, violent true crime story? What does our ongoing fascination with the myth of Bonnie and Clyde actually say about us as a society? I want you to think about that massive disparity between the Hollywood legend and the gruesome reality the next time you hear their names. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. I hope this deep dive brought you some real clarity today. Keep learning, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.